One of the most mind-blowing economic transformations in human history. When we look at Switzerland today, people basically call it paradise on earth. We kind of just assume it was always blessed with infinite wealth. But that is completely wrong. So how exactly did a seemingly doomed, freezing nation built on a pile of rock transform itself into this massive global economic empire? Let's unpack the whole thing.
Picture this. It's 1816, and the Swiss people are starving. And I don't just mean a bad harvest. I mean they were practically eating grass, moss, and tree bark just to survive. Swiss kids were literally walking all the way to Germany just to find work as manual laborers. By all accounts, it was a guaranteed failure of a state. Now, contrast that with the modern Switzerland we know today. They refine about 70% of the entire world's gold. They're exporting luxury watches that cost way more than sports cars, and their per capita GDP sits at a staggering $100,000. That is higher than the Germans, the Americans, and the Russians. So the absolute million-dollar question here is, how on earth did they pull off this impossible miracle? To really grasp the scale of what they achieved, we have to talk about their geographic curse. Think about this. An unbelievable 75% of Switzerland's land is pure, unforgiving mountain terrain. It's a completely landlocked, isolated country dealing with extreme freezing conditions. It's incredibly difficult to farm, or honestly, even just to connect two neighboring towns together. Geographically speaking, their extreme isolation and rugged terrain actually mirrored places like Afghanistan much more than the rest of Western Europe.
And to make matters worse, unlike a place like Dubai, which eventually struck oil, or America and Russia, which are sitting on practically every resource you can imagine, from coal to natural gas to endless coastlines, the Swiss had absolutely zero natural wealth to rely on. Nothing. No oil, no coal, no gold, no iron, and zero access to sea trade routes. They were starting the game completely empty-handed.
That brings us to Section 1, the infrastructure miracle, and the vision of Alfred Escher.
So a visionary politician and businessman named Alfred Escher looked around and realized that for Switzerland to survive, they had to pull off the impossible. They needed to build a massive railway network across a frozen, rocky wilderness, and they had to do it with absolutely no money. To understand his urgency, you have to look at the global boom happening in the 1850s. Railways were dropping the cost of transportation by an unbelievable 95%. A farmer in Pittsburgh was suddenly using trains to sell horseradish and ketchup nationwide, building a brand we now know as Kraft Heinz. A pharmacist in Atlanta was using them to build the Coca-Cola empire. Britain, France, Germany, they were all building these rapid industrial empires, while the Swiss were quite literally still pushing wooden carts over mountain passes. Escher managed to pass a Railway Act in 1852, but they still had a glaring problem: zero funding. How do you raise an absolute fortune in a dirt-poor country? Well, Escher decided to just create his own bank, which, by the way, we know today as Credit Suisse. Instead of begging foreign banks for loans, he rolled out 3 million shares directly to the Swiss people. And here's the crazy part. The Swiss people believed in this vision so deeply that the shares were oversubscribed 73 times over. The citizens literally funded their own salvation. But hey, throwing money at a mountain doesn't magically drill a tunnel. Jammed right between Germany to the north and Italy to the south was the Alps, this 3-kilometer-high wall of solid rock that had cursed Switzerland for 600 years. Getting over it through the Gotthard Pass took 3 grueling days of dragging mules through the ice, and it was only even open 5 months out of the entire year. Escher decided to drive a railway straight through the heart of it. They drilled for 10 straight years, and when they finally broke through, that brutal 3-day journey collapsed into just 8 smooth hours. Transportation costs plummeted by over 80%. They threaded rails through valleys and tiny alpine villages, essentially building the densest railway network on planet Earth and turning their landlocked weakness into Europe's ultimate trading hub.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, Europe's ultimate talent haven.
Because here's the thing, infrastructure is great, but it's only half the battle. Switzerland suddenly had the tracks and the capital, but they had zero engineering colleges or local talent to actually design these modern marvels. So what was their solution? Well, in 1848, revolutions and chaos were erupting all across Europe. In France, Germany, Austria, Italy, people were rising up and demanding an end to the monarchies. The entire continent was basically burning. But Switzerland, they did the exact opposite. They wrote a new constitution that legally guaranteed free speech, free press, and free assembly. Almost overnight, they became the safest, most stable country in Europe. And because of that brilliant move, Europe's greatest, most persecuted minds packed up their lives and fled straight to Zurich.
Just think about the sheer caliber of the talent that was showing up at their doorstep, often with arrest warrants from their home countries. You had Richard Wagner completely reshaping Western music, Vladimir Lenin plotting revolution right out of a Zurich library. You had Zurich's incredibly progressive university producing the very first female doctor in all of Europe. And some of the most brilliant professors in the world suddenly arrived, helping to build world-class institutions like the Federal Polytechnic in Zurich, which is the exact same school that would later produce Albert Einstein. The Swiss didn't have to spend a dime to train this talent. They just offered a safe haven and rescued them during a crisis.
All right, let's jump to Section 3, loophole economics, or basically selling what they lack. Now, this is where the story gets truly fascinating. The Swiss engineered this brilliant, essentially zero-cost strategy. They figured out a way to sell money they didn't have, medicine they didn't invent, and chocolate they couldn't even grow. Let's break down exactly how they engineered each of these three massive pillars of their modern economy, because it's genius.
First up is banking. Now, throughout human history, whenever there's global fear or the threat of war, people immediately seek safety for their wealth, right? Well, in 1934, just before World War II kicked off, Switzerland passed a massive defining piece of legislation. This law made it a literal criminal offense for any banker to reveal the identity of a Swiss bank account owner. They basically took the abstract concept of privacy and legally engineered it into their most valuable export product.
And this specific policy positioned Switzerland in a highly unique way during the Second World War. By 1941, the Swiss franc was essentially the only freely convertible currency left that the international community trusted, especially since German marks were basically worthless for global trade. The historical data shows that the Nazi Party sold massive reserves of gold to Swiss banks in exchange for those trusted francs. We're talking roughly 1.2 billion francs of Nazi gold, which translates to about $2.5 billion in today's money. Switzerland managed to serve as the primary banking hub during this massive global conflict simply by offering an absolutely impenetrable financial safe haven. Next up, let's look at pharma. How exactly does a country with zero chemical wealth become the pharmaceutical capital of the world? The answer is a massive, century-long legal loophole. Back in the 1800s, France heavily patented a super lucrative dye called fuchsin. The Swiss saw a massive opportunity here and just refused to recognize those patents. They allowed all intellectual property to be freely copied on Swiss soil for 100 straight years. Naturally, chemists rushed across the border into Switzerland, where they could copy formulas, manufacture them, make an absolute fortune, deposit the cash right into those secret Swiss bank accounts, and never worry about getting sued. That copied dye industry quietly evolved into medicinal drugs, which eventually created a pharmaceutical empire that exports $169 billion annually today. Unbelievable. And then, of course, there is chocolate. The ultimate irony here? Absolutely zero cocoa grows in Switzerland. Not a single bean. Yet they are the global gold standard for chocolate. Why? Because of pure processing innovation. Back in 1875, a guy named Daniel Peter figured out how to mix condensed milk with cocoa powder, which laid the exact groundwork for the massive company we now know as Nestle. Shortly after that, Rudolf Lindt invented something called conching. It's this process of rolling the bitter, gritty cocoa endlessly until it becomes that silky magic we all love. They didn't grow the raw material, they just mastered the processing to absolute perfection, launching billion-dollar empires in the process.
And they applied this exact same logic to their manufacturing sector. It's often said that Swiss watches were basically the iPhones of the 1900s. The Swiss would take incredibly cheap, practically worthless base materials like iron and brass, and through obsessive world-class engineering, they turned them into flawless luxury obsessions. In a market full of basic commodities, they chose to sell perfection, creating another export product worth billions and billions of dollars.
Bringing it all together, we hit Section 4, playing a 200-year game, and the lessons for the future. Let's step back for a second and look at the big picture. What does all of this mean for developing nations today? Take a country like India, for example, which sits on literally 100 times the natural resources Switzerland ever had. Well, there are three undeniable lessons we can draw directly from the Swiss miracle. Number one, you have to build world-class connectivity. While the Swiss were blasting train tunnels through a 3-kilometer rock wall 150 years ago to drive billion-dollar trade, lots of resource-rich nations today are still endlessly debating basic freight corridors. Number two, you must become a magnet for talent. You can't keep losing your brightest minds to the West just because of a lack of local opportunities. And number three, swift policy execution. The Swiss managed to turn every single disadvantage into a massive advantage by passing bold laws in a matter of months, while other nations will sit around debating the exact same policies for decades until the window of opportunity completely closes.
Switzerland in the 1850s was starving, completely disconnected, and bleeding its workforce. They didn't magically become a $100,000 per capita economic juggernaut just because they got lucky. They succeeded because one generation made the highly conscious, difficult decision to play a 200-year game, and they executed that strategy relentlessly without ever flinching. So as we wrap up today's explainer, I really want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. Look at the long-term strategies of your own nations right now. Is our generation truly bold enough to push our systems to their limits and to